Now, our story is about a story of women. Grandpa Lucas is the grandfather, and he owns a timber mill. And he's always told them that they need to sell the timber mill and leave the South because the Civil War is coming. And he has all these daughters and granddaughters, a family of all females, and he knows that the timber mill will be lost and that it could be a dangerous place and time for a family of all women. So he has made plans for them to leave and to go to Fort Worth, Texas. Now, Fort Worth, Texas was a military post, and all of the military left in 1856 to move on west to fight the Comanches. And so the towns were just kind of left, and Texas had been supporting the effort of homesteaders coming and settling on the land, but with no fort there was no general store and no supplies and no freight line. So that was what he planned to do with his granddaughters. Now, Liz is our main character, and her younger sister is Megan. Liz and Megan came to live with the grandfather when they were very young, just little girls, after the death of their parents. Now, the Abby and Emma are cousins, and they came from a big plantation in Mississippi, and they have a difficult relationship with their father. And so they have left, and he has pretty much just said, you know, you girls are too headstrong, and you know, I didn't have any sons. I don't want you anyway. You can leave. So the girls left to go to Grandpa Lucas's house and to go in the wagons. There's going to be, I think, 8 wagons that are going west. There's going to be a couple of drivers. John and Blue are 2 of the men that worked at the timber mill that are going. And then Thomas is our leading male character, and he has worked at the timber mill for many, many years. And his best friend was Caleb, and Caleb was the one that was married to Liz. We also found out in the first few chapters of the book that he was killed about a year ago at the timber mill in a logging accident there, and that his body was never found as it was swept away with the logs in the river and downstream. They never found Caleb. She is still holding to the fact that there's a possibility that he's alive and that he could come back. And Liz and Caleb had one son, and his name is Luke, named after the grandfather, Grandpa Lucas. So we're going to start in on the very first book, Threads of Change. We're going to be on page 50, and that is chapter 5. Chapter 5 and 6 are pretty small chapters, so I'm going to see if I can go on and do chapter 7 also today. For those of you that are interested in the hard copy books, you can go to our website, squareandsquare.com, and you can get those. We have a special on them, and any that are bought through our website will be autographed for you. And if you like e-readers, you can also go to wherever you purchase your e-readers and look for Jodi Barrows and the Threads series. So here we're going to start today, chapter 5. The ladies completed their morning routine in record time and hastily made their way into the sewing room. It had one large window and a small closet that had been turned into a bookshelf, and the wooden floor still looked new, as though they had somehow escaped the passage of time. A large yellow cat stealthily paced the floor in front of Emma and rubbed against her leg. "Where have you been hiding?" Emma asked, reaching down to pet the plump yellow ball of fur. "Oh, that's Samson," Liz said. "He's very old." "Oh, well, aren't you the most charming old fellow?" she greeted in a baby voice. "Where have you been hiding?" Liz had grown very anxious to quilt. The last few days had been filled with loading and work, with no time left for quilting. Now they gathered around the quilt frame with their sewing baskets and started at once. Abby licked the eye of the needle and pressed the heavy cotton thread into it. "I can't wait to get started on this quilt." They all watched, observing Abby's technique. "I thought you licked the thread, not the needle," Megan said, "to help thread it quickly." "Well, you can, I suppose, but a friend of Mother's always said to do it this way." Abby smiled as each of her fellow seamstresses eagerly tried the new hint. One by one, they placed the eye of the needle between their lips to moisten the opening, and then pointed the tip of the thread into the eye of the needle. threading them the very first time with no trouble. "Isn't that wonderful?" Megan exclaimed. The quilt top on which they worked wasn't especially big. Megan had called it a lap size because it just covered a person when seated. "I like this smaller size," Emma told them. "I think you could even hang it on a wall, like a picture." Liz chuckled over the idea of hanging a quilt on the wall. Its only purpose would be a source of beauty, a wall decoration, which seemed like a rather astonishing idea. The quilt, layered with cotton batting in the middle, would be covered at the back with a length of muslin. Stretched tightly in the wooden frame, it might finish up quickly as a smaller piece of applique art, and of course, because 4 talented hands flew across it. Each of their needles had been threaded with a knot at the end of the thread, except for Liz's. She never used a knot. Instead, she used a double backstitch each time she started a line of stitches. The eye of the needle allowed the thread to move through it without hindrance as she worked each stitch into the quilt. The needle pushed into the middle layer of the batting and pulled through tightly, popping the knot into the batting and between the layers of the quilt sandwich. An accomplished quilter would never allow a knot to show on either side of the quilt. And Liz knew that each seamstress at this particular quilt frame could be considered an expert with the needle. Abby and Emma had been taught the art of needle by their mother, Catherine, the youngest daughter of Lucas Maley. Elizabeth and Megan were taught by their grandmother, Claire. Like the pieces of the quilt that they'd fit together so carefully, the women of their family were sewn expertly together by the stitches of their shared love for the art of quilting. The women in the community were always excited to go to a quilt gathering, sometimes called a quiltin' or quilting bee. One of their projects could be finished rather quickly with so many hands at work, and sewing secrets were passed around as readily as community news and activities. Not to be confused with the local gossip, of course, a behavior which the church gatherings frowned upon. "I will certainly miss our little group of quilting friends," Megan said to Liz, as if she'd read her sister's thoughts. Turning to Abby and Emma, she added, "We have a lovely group of friends here in Lecomte. I hope we'll have one in our new home, too." Row after row, the thimbled fingers loaded stitches into the applique, flowered pattern quilt. The ladies rolled it several times as the work progressed from the pattern that their grandmother Claire had designed a myriad of years ago. Liz concentrated on her stitches, 12 to the inch to be exact. 2 gray kittens played with old Samson's tail, which had a mind of its own. They swatted and jumped at it as another kitten curled around Abby's leg under the quilt frame and rolled itself into her skirt, making it look like a gossamer puddle on the floor. Liz was finally at the end of her thread when Emma and Megan left quilting to prepare some lunch. She slid the needle under the top layer of fabric and secured a backstitch to the cotton batting. She pulled out her embroidered scissors and neatly clipped the thread before placing her needle into the edge of the spool. "We certainly have accomplished a lot this morning," she said, looking over the quilt. Her fingers smoothed over the tiny stitches she had just placed. "It's coming along nicely," she said, mostly to herself. The playful kitten suddenly jumped into her lap, and she jumped. "Callie, you silly thing, I surely will miss you." She stroked the soft fur and held the kitten to her face. Liz felt Abby's eyes on her. "Abby, I'm so glad you are here. It has been far too long. I was beyond excitement to hear that you and Emma were willing to make the move. I'm sorry your cousin Sadie wasn't able to come too." Abby reached for Liz's hand across the quilt and smiled. "Grandpa is so certain about this political unrest." "It's frightful, Liz." "I know." Liz gently squeezed Abby's fingers. "Let's not worry ourselves, though. Grandpa seems certain of this move, and I have faith in him." "Yes, I do as well, but that doesn't mean that I won't worry." "Well, let's not dwell on matters we can't change." Abby nodded in agreement. "Are you excited about your new teaching engagement?" Liz asked her. Pastor Parker seems so nice, and his wife Anna does too. Yes, I am, excited and worried all at once. Abby expelled a deep breath. I do not know where to begin. I have to be careful not to scare myself into running back to my Mississippi classroom. We'll take it one day at a time, Liz offered her soft words of comfort and a pat on her hand. Together. Liz, I'm very curious about Texas, and I do not feel that I know much about it. What can you tell me? Abby pressed. Help me settle my nerves. Liz sighed before she began. I understand the weather is actually quite similar to here, hot and such, only fewer trees and less rain, which might not be too terrible. Our area has trees and a river, the Trinity River to be more specific. Sounds almost like home, doesn't it? Except they say it's ranch country. It has cattle grazing land and open prairie. Cattle with great long horns roam about all over. Grandpa and Thomas are always talking on the porch about this ranching. Thomas told me that a person could round up as many of these long horns as he wishes, brand them, and they belong to him. Abby smiled at her cousin's description. The idea of a ranch is very exciting to them. Luke is taken with the idea of being a cowboy, but Grandpa Lucas forgets how advanced he is in years now. He never quits, and Thomas seems to forget that Grandpa isn't a young man anymore, too. Thomas has just stepped into the shoes Caleb wore in Grandpa's life, and Luke's too. Liz paused, realizing what she had just said. Well, what about you, Liz? Has he stepped into those shoes for you? I haven't thought about it exactly like that. Liz looked at Abby as tears filled her eyes again. She tried to blink them back. I still feel married, except that I get lonely. My heart hurts, but I want to feel better. And she paused. If forgetting Caleb is what I have to do to get better, then I don't see that I can do it. I will never be able to do that. I have not been here long, my dear cousin, but I can see that Thomas adores you. He doesn't have to court you. He is already here. He is already in this family, and he is a gentleman. I think he's waiting for you to make room in your heart for him. He won't be assertive, Liz. My only advice is not to wait too long for happiness to find you. Megan and Emma appeared with sandwiches and lemonade on a tray, and Abby reached for her drink. We have much work ahead of us, Liz told them. Though we've already accomplished so much, there is even more once we reach Texas. She looked to the others for support. Emma leaned forward, propping her elbows on the edge of the quilt frame with her chin in her hands. I'm growing more excited each day. I can barely manage the anticipation. And though it's exciting, a part of me feels frightened too. I only wish Grandpa was coming with us now and not later. Megan munched on something crunchy and prepared to speak. At first, I always felt frightened, and though it may come again, I have confidence in us. We may be women, but we can do this. I've no doubt. It's an opportunity, and as such, it will be wonderful. The ladies were amused at Megan's outlook. Besides, she said, I've become a wonderful shot. She raised her hand to look like a revolver and pretended to blow smoke from its barrel. They all laughed at Megan as she sat down, still in an excited state of mind as she continued. I am most excited at the prospects of having a dress shop. Just wait until you see the new treadle sewing machine work. We ordered it from Chicago, you know. I paid for it myself. The dresses will simply fly off the machine. She finally stopped for air, carefully sipping her lemonade, as Liz smiled affirmingly at her sister's words. It will be a hard life for a while. I don't know how far the water is. We might have to carry it. We might even have to live in our wagons. It certainly won't be as comfortable as we have it here. Emma's eyes opened wide and round as saucers as she listened to Liz speak. We will experience firsthand how our grandmothers lived, she told them. We'll get to know what their daily life was really like. Chapter 6. Liz sat on the front porch mending the binding on Grandpa Lucas's favorite quilt, which he himself had named Southern Skies, for the long, thin blue and red star points. The background had been constructed from tan scraps, and he told Liz that the stars were as big and beautiful as the stars in the Louisiana night sky. Lucas loved to sit on the porch as much as Liz did. When she was a little girl, he told her the story of the geese flying south for the winter and how the birds knew when to fly north or south. He said the birds supported and encouraged each other in the journey. The bird in the lead had the hardest job because it had to break the wind currents for the others behind him. Thus, each bird behind the front one had an easier time flying. The flock always flew in the V formation. Her grandfather had taught her. The last held the resting and coasting spot. They squawked as they flew over the Maley property, and Grandpa Lucas said the birds voiced their support and encouragement to each other, praising the lead bird for its leadership. If a goose is injured and needs to leave the group, Grandpa had said, they send down several to aid him in his recovery. They can join up with another flock when the injured bird is ready and able to fly. Grandpa Lucas had always said that people needed to be like these creatures, praising the leaders, encouraging others, and working hard. When Liz made Grandpa's quilt, she put 12 flying geese in each block. She told him that it made her think of the time they spent on the porch together and hearing his lessons about life. Liz would miss the porch, but it calmed her knowing that her family would go with her and they could build a new one. She felt tired. She endured some busy, laborious days preparing for the trip west. Liz looked at the 6 wagons standing packed with goods. The structures looked like they might give birth at any time. They stood waiting as a metaphor for the new life now upon Liz and her family. Her family had already retired, all of them as tired as Liz, but she hadn't been able to sleep. She spent many nights out on the porch lately, this one her last. In the morning, she would leave the Maley home. She would leave Riverton. Liz prayerfully pondered God's promises. She asked for wisdom and guidance and health and safety. She asked for strength and endurance. She thanked him for Thomas, who was willing to travel such a long way with them, and for Chet, who knew Texas as his home, agreeing to act as their scout. Liz sat rocking comfortably in the knowledge that the Texas Rangers would help guide them in the more dangerous areas. Grandpa Lucas had thought of everything. Please, God, she requested one more time. Protection, special protection. A penny for your thoughts, her grandfather asked. He stood in the doorway, holding his pipe in hand. Liz looked his way. I just finished mending your favorite quilt. Thank you, Liz. You know how much I love those southern skies. He stepped forward, leaning on a post of the porch as he lit his pipe. She looked down at the flying geese on the quilt. These birds are amazing, the way God created their nature. She looked up to the grandfather and smiled. She looked up to her grandfather and smiled. Grandpa, how do you know they are squawking encouragement to each other? Maybe they're just cranky. Smoke curled up from his pipe, and he crossed one leg over the ankle of the other. She knew his eyes were twinkling through the darkness as he chuckled. I choose to believe in the good and positive, Liz. Besides, a little bird told me. She stood up, placed the quilt in the rocker, and went to her grandfather. With her arms around him, she said, I miss you already. Her voice cracked, and she looked out over his shoulder and blinked back, a burn from her eyes. I'm a little melancholy about leaving my home, but I'm ready to go. In the morning, I'll be ready. Changing the subject, she asked, Why aren't you in bed? I was waiting on my quilt, he chuckled. Can't sleep without it, you know. She picked it up and placed it in his arms. I love you. I love you too, Liz. I will see you soon, real soon, when the birds fly south. Liz looked back at her grandfather on the night porch and chiseled the picture in her heart. I never want to forget this moment. And I want to point out the quilt here that's hanging here. This is the Southern Skies quilt with the flying geese all together. Liz must have fallen asleep the very moment her head hit the pillow. She didn't even remember saying her nightly prayer. Liz rolled over in the darkness to face the window. Her hair in her eyes, she brushed it aside. "Is it morning yet?" she whispered. She aroused and went to the window, peeking out. No sun yet. While she slept, the moon had slid across the sky, now showing from a position opposite of where she had seen it last. The stars glistened over the house, and the 6 wagons waited in the yard, waiting for their dusty day ahead when they would be useful and satisfied. Excitement squeezed her insides. She slipped back into her warm bed and tried to sleep, knowing she might regret not having a full night's rest when weariness caught up with her on the trail. A pink ray of sunlight sliced through Liz's morning curtains and splashed against her face and pillow. Within just a few short moments, she was in the kitchen preparing a small breakfast and packing a lunch they all might eat along the journey. She wrapped a piece of bread and cheese in a small cloth for everyone, and then placed each of them into a larger cloth sack that held 2 green apples and a tin cup. She made a sack for each person and planned to place the sacks under the wagon benches for later. Cheese might prove a real luxury for lunch along the trail on their first day. Afterwards, high temperatures would surely spoil such treats. From then on, they would have to eat dried meats, breads, and beans. Hopefully the men could kill some game for dinner each night. The jar of preserved fruit and other items from the cellar, packed neatly away in the sawdust, would serve them for special occasions or hard times on the trail. The 4 chickens she planned to bring along would hopefully provide eggs for their nourishment. Grandpa Lucas had already risen, and Liz saw him outside inspecting the wagons once again, reassuring himself of their trailworthiness. In one wagon, he placed several extra wooden wheels and other materials that would be useful if the original ones were damaged during the journey. Liz knew how surprisingly easy a wheel could break. Sometimes the spokes caught and stripped the insides away, or, as happened more often than any other scenario, the bolts would wiggle off and lose hold of the wagon, sending the wagon down in a dusty crash. Grandpa Lucas had seen this happen many times before, and Liz knew he wanted to ensure they would have enough material in the instant that it happened along the trail. After the group had gathered in the kitchen and had quickly eaten their breakfast, they collected all of their essentials that could not be packed the night before and placed them in their appropriate wagons. Most of the meal workers waited in the yard next to the wagon, noticeably intrigued that Lucas Maley had actually allowed his 4 granddaughters to embark on such a voyage west alone. It was a rare occurrence for any woman or group of women to have such an opportunity. Liz supposed that in essence it positioned a stepping stone in their small community, and she hoped that stepping stone might be utilized by other women in the months and years to come, again and again. Liz placed his mother's chickens into her wagon, and Liz surveyed the placement, adjusting the wooden as she saw fit. Luke smiled at his mom and gave her a hug. They could drop off, she defended. It's not going to be trails like the trails were much shakier and not used so often. Are you set? He asked her. Liz's eyes widened and she smiled. Yes, I suppose I'm all set. Good. I can't wait to get out of here. I wonder how far we'll make it today. Liz smiled. I'm going to have to stop for just a second. Hang on. Sorry about that. I'm back. Liz smiled at Luke's excitement. Where's Bear? Grandpa has him, he said, motioning toward his grandfather and Thomas. Bear, come boy, Luke whistled. The fluffy-haired black ball ran towards them, stopping just in time to keep from colliding with Liz. Luke patted the dog's sides and rubbed his head with 2 hands. Are you all set, boy? The dog grew more and more excited with Luke's encouraging words, and he began to bark. Good boy, Luke assured him. The wagons had been lined up according to Grandpa Lucas's instructions and stood patiently with drivers now on board. Liz's grandfather had decided that the best manner to travel would be in pairs, 2 wagons traveling side by side and 2 wagons traveling behind and so forth. This arrangement allowed each person to have a partner who could assist them if necessary. The wagons had been arranged accordingly, and Grandpa Lucas appeared satisfied to have the matter settled in his favor. As the trail master for the wagon train, Thomas took the lead out front. He had almost agreed with Grandpa Lucas that this method of travel was a good idea, in case one of the ladies needed help with the team. Behind his wagon, Liz and Megan teamed up, then Abby and Emma, Luke and Blue, and John as a single at the back. Chet planned to ride on horseback. Thomas saddled his horse and began. Thomas's saddle horse had been tied to the side of his lead wagon, and Grandpa Lucas insisted that they take a few extra horses along, leaving them fresh in case they were needed to scout ahead or to search for water. These horses had been tied to the back of John's wagon. It looks like we're rough and ready, Luke exclaimed, and he wrapped his arm around his mother's shoulder. The current of excitement emanating from him felt pulsating. We're off to start a whole new life. Liz took one last look over her shoulder before she nodded. A whole new life. Have I truly let go of the old one? Lucas had given each of his granddaughters a final hug, and Thomas noticed Liz's pretty eyes well up with emotion as she turned away. Lucas saluted the men with a handshake and a few words of advice, and he asked everyone to join him as he said a prayer for them before they left. He asked God to keep his hand over the group and to guide them in safety and health. He asked special wisdom and grace for Thomas as the trail master and for the overall protection of each person, calling each one of them by name. Amen, everyone said together as he finished his prayer. Lucas raised his hand to Liz. Will those chickens be a bother? They won't, Liz quipped. They know how much I love chicken soup. Thomas, yes, sir. Take my women to Texas. I will, sir, he replied with a firm nod. The mill workers who stood watching erupted into applause, clapping and hollering at the wagons, waving their hands and shouting with goodbyes. Thomas slapped the reins and shouted at his horse to start them off. The wagons pulled out of the yard while all of the mill workers and Lucas stood by watching and waving. Thomas looked back as he rounded the curve and caught a glimpse of Liz as she watched the house and her beloved porch grow smaller and smaller in the distance. He imagined how she felt like she might never see it again. When he couldn't see Lucas anymore, Thomas looked out at the river until it disappeared as well. His heart lurched a bit for Liz as she said goodbye to everything she knew, including Caleb, putting it all behind her and boldly heading forward into the great unknown. When they reached the edge of the Maley property, Liz glanced over at Megan, who could hardly stay seated over the wagon bench as her petite gloved hands drove the team of horses. Liz smiled at her sister. She had always admired Megan's love for life, evident in the small things. She found the oddest satisfaction for living in the day-to-day matters, special ways she held the stem of a flower bulb before placing it carefully into the allotted hole, or the way she threaded a needle and secured a perfect knot, even the way she cleaned house. "We're leaving. I can't believe this," Megan exclaimed to Liz, trying to talk over the noise of the horses and wagons. "We're actually leaving Riverton. Did you ever dream?" She bit the side of her lip and tried to smile at her sister. She'd never once dreamed of leaving Riverton or the timber mill. The lone tear found its way to her chin again, and she quickly looked back as she went around the final bend in the road. She caught sight of her grandfather on the porch with his hand held high, still waving. "No, I never dreamed of leaving it all behind one day." Chapter 7, page 64. The hot sun boldly perched straight overhead. Thomas was pleased that the group had made a surprisingly good distance for the time they had been on the trail. Chet rode over the crest of a small hill and slowed his horse to the speed of Thomas's wagon, and Thomas motioned toward the rain to the right side of them. Chet's head dodged in that direction. "What's up? How does it look over there?" Thomas asked. "Still like Louisiana," Chet joked. "Go back and make sure the others are doing fine. If we can find water, I'd like to stop for the horses. I'll tell them." Chet pushed back and rode back a short way to where Liz and Megan were driving. "Hello," Thomas heard him call out, slowing his horse to their speed. After Chet had confirmed that each wagon was doing fine, he rode on to relay the news to Thomas. "Good," Thomas said. Did you tell them that we would stop soon?" "Yes, I did. They supposed the sooner the better." "They need to stop?" "I reckon everyone would like a break soon." "Very well. See if we can scout a place for water. We've been traveling parallel to a large creek, almost 6 feet across, I'd say." "Really?" "For about 3 miles. Can you lead the way?" Chet dipped his head and nodded. "It's only a short way. Follow me." The wagons tracked off to the right with Chet leading the way up ahead. Thomas spotted a thick group of low trees, and just beyond them a rocky area and a flowing creek, almost 6 feet across, just as Chet had said. The wagons came to a halt before reaching the area of thick growth that bordered the creek at a wide perch where the horses could enjoy the shade and drink water. The ladies quickly unloaded and headed upstream a bit to wash and enjoy the fresh water. Blue, John, and Lucas walked to the creek downstream from the women and filled several buckets from which the horses could drink. Chet and Thomas stayed behind with the wagons and horses. "Everything is going well," Chet said as Thomas took a long drink from his canteen and then pushed the cork lid over the opening. "So far," he said flatly. "It's not what's up ahead that concerns me. It's what's traveling behind us." Chet glanced over his shoulder. "Behind us? What do you mean?" "The women," Thomas said, wiping his mouth. Chet looked concerned. "Why? What did Lucas say about the women?" "To watch out for them." "We've only gotten started." "Anything could go wrong when half your wagon train is compromised of women," Thomas joked, but a sense of serious concern washed over him, and he shook his head. "What I mean is that we're still close to Pineville, and the ladies don't seem anxious just yet. But they're women. They could easily change their mind. And really, I have no wish to turn around to Pineville for their sake." Chet cut in. "Do you really think they would turn back?" "We should keep a close eye on that for a few days." Thomas propped his arm on the wagon. A man never knows what a woman might do, and they've left everything they know behind. Chet reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small bottle of homemade sour mash. He took a short swig and extended the bottle for Thomas. "Just what I need," Thomas said, and he took a long gulp. "Thank you." Chet put the bottle back inside his vest. "I like to camp close to the water tonight," Thomas said. "See if you can find out how long this stream carries. The place where it breaks off in the other direction is where we'll camp." "You'd like for me to go now?" "Yes," Thomas nodded. "Keep your pistol handy," he warned. "Very well," Chet said, loosening the reins of his horse, and he immediately vaulted into the saddle. "See if you can find something for dinner, too." Chet tipped his hat to Thomas. "Yah!" Chet commanded, kicking his spurs at the horse. He disappeared almost instantly through the thick brush. Thomas waited like a mother hen as the ladies went about their business, not realizing for a minute or so that he'd been holding his breath. Blue walked up from the creek and must have seen his face. Slapping him on the back, he told him, "Relax, cowboy. Everything's fine." "You're right," he said, slightly startled as he removed his hat. "Lucas will kill me 3 times over if I don't keep his granddaughters in one piece." "Everything will be fine. They aren't children." "Yes, they're women," Thomas laughed. "Did the horses get water?" "Yeah," Blue replied with a chuckle. "I'm going to look over the wagons another time. I think the middle one is rattling too much for our own good. Then we'll only have to wait for Chet and the women to return." Thomas stood up and stretched. "You should rest some," Blue said. "The sun is out, and it's hot and strong today." Thomas quickly found a place in the shade and sat down, with his back leaning against a large tree. Blue busied himself looking over the wagons and inspecting them for cracks around the wheels. He'd helped Lucas build most of them, and Thomas felt confident in his familiarity with the assembly. Thomas tilted his hat over his eyes and dozed off almost immediately after sitting down. He hadn't planned to sleep, but the late afternoon sun was enticing enough to the strongest of men grew tired under its intensity and vigor. The ladies chatted relentlessly as they walked their way upstream. Their legs had grown tired and cramped, and Liz felt thankful for the opportunity to stretch. As Megan squatted beside the water and bathed her hands in its coolness, she realized the rains had done their worst on her sister's uncalloused hands. "Hurry, Megan, you can do that later," Emma squealed. "I've got to go badly." "Why wouldn't Thomas allow us to stop?" he chimed in. Just drive on, he says." The women laughed at her impatience of Thomas. She even acted out the hand gestures just as Thomas did when he gave directions or talked seriously about something. "Gracious," Megan said, "I've been driving for such a time, my hands have become raw from the rains." "Megan's right, Liz," Abby suddenly said. "You must talk with Thomas about this." Emma nodded in agreement. "Riding so hard on our first day out," Megan joined in as she gathered up her skirt, "can't be good for us. It can't be healthy." "Why am I the only one who has to tell Thomas we need a break?" Liz protested. "Well, you are the oldest, of course," Megan said, as if she should understand. Abby agreed. "If anyone were to talk with him, it should be you. I'll speak with him." "Lizzie," Abby said, as she looked at her hands and wiggled her fingers, "look at my hands. Are yours so swollen?" "Good heavens, dear lady," Liz said, holding her cousin's red and swollen hands. "Megan's are faintly red, but nothing like yours." "You don't need to hold the reins so stiffly," Megan said. Only tug when the horses need to be commanded. I must have held them too tightly without realizing it." "Let's fill our canteens down here," Liz told them, watching her steps as she made her way down to the water. The others followed her down the creek, and they all washed their hands and chatted for a time.